Chapter 22, Urza's Mitre. "How can he stay in these collars?" asked Tawnos, tugging at the starched fabric around his neck. "I can't," replied Urza. "When I was a child, I hated any ceremony that forced me to dress up. I think it's one of the reasons religion fell out of favor among the nobility. It's too uncomfortable to dress for." Both men wore stiff cotton shirts with even stiffer woolen jackets, accompanied by heavy woolen pants. Each garment was ironed with knife-edge folds. Leather boots, new and shined to an incandescent glow, were equally unwieldy. To Tawnos, they felt more like lead weights than footwear. The ceremonial gear was mandated by the most august of ceremonies in which they were about to take part. Tawnos wondered if they could just send the outfits and stay home themselves. Reflecting, Tawnos thought the pair had gotten off lucky. There were costumes and ceremonial uniforms among the gentry that reminded him of a ship under full sail, so festooned were they with ribbons, banners, and medals. But Argiv had never had a Lord High Artificer and Protector of the Realms before, nor a Master Scholar. As a result, both men were shielded from the worst of past pageantry. Tawnos had always heard the Argivians were a dour, serious people. Even the way they treated such a celebration was further proof, he thought. Never had he seen so many people dead set on enjoying themselves. They were single-minded, even grim, in their pursuit of pleasure. The past month had shown that beyond a doubt. There had been celebrations beyond measure in Penregon. First, a royal wedding between the young crown prince of Argiv and the granddaughter of the redoubtable lord of Corliss. Then the official notice of abdication of the venerable, if weak, Argivian king in favor of the crown prince and his new bride. Then there was the official recognition of the combined kingdoms of Argiv and Corliss, though Corliss was effectively subsumed politically into Argiv. And now the final act, recognition of Urza as Lord High Artificer and Protector of the realm of the combined kingdoms. The nobles of Argiv were behind it all. They had been feuding with their own crown for years. The king, now referred to as the Old King, advocated a policy of containment and appeasement of the desert tribes. That policy had been destroyed with Krug, along with whatever power the king still held. The nobles were behind the royal marriage, along with the merchants and Corliss. They were no doubt instrumental as well in convincing the Argivian king to relinquish his crown. Tawnos knew for a fact that the nobles had pressed Urza to accept the scepter and mitre of the Lord Protector of the Realms. What Tawnos did not understand is why Urza had accepted the position. When Tawnos put the question to him, the artificer offered a weak excuse. At least it seemed weak to Tawnos. "In Yosha," said Urza, "the warlord let me build my devices, but I had little control over their use and never sufficient resources to develop them properly, even as chief artificer. Now, as Lord Protector, I can control the use of my devices and will have full access to sufficient resources." "I'm not sure about the nature of that control," returned Tawnos. "From what I've seen, even leaders are driven by events and situations beyond their control. That includes the will of the masses. Already there are those who will call to retake Yosha." "That may well yet happen," said Urza, "but it will occur with a mechanized force. One filled with Avengers, mechanical soldiers, and the new Sentinels we're designing." "It may happen before we have a chance to finish the work," said Tawnos. "In fact, this new position may bring you under new pressure to launch an attack." Urza ground his palms together slowly. Last he shrugged. "You may be right, my former student." "Then why accept the mitre and scepter?" demanded Tawnos. "I have another reason," said Urza, and closed his mouth firmly. Tawnos wanted to press Urza about what such a reason could be, when the door to the room flew open. A small metal bird fluttered into the room, chased by young Harbin. The 7-year-old laughed and lunged at the small bird, which dodged his blows effortlessly and circled the room. Tawnos whistled a short tune, and the bird came to rest on the mantelpiece. The boy also quieted immediately, suddenly aware of the others in the room. "Uncle Tawnos?" he said with a smile. Then his face turned stern. "Father, I'm sorry for interrupting." Urza smiled gently and said, "No interruption." He looked at the bird. "One of yours?" he asked Tawnos. Tawnos shrugged. "A small distraction, using some of the ideas we've been working with. It avoids the boy's blows because it detects the air moving in front of his hands, much as an insect would. He can catch it if he moves slowly, but I've never seen a young boy who has that much patience." Urza nodded. "Yoshans may have many souls, but at your core, you're still a toy maker." Lady Kayla, queen in exile of Yosha, had entered behind the boy. while a servant carrying her cloak remained outside. "Harbin, you know better than to disturb your follower and Tanos." Urza allowed himself another gentle smile and said again, "No interruption. On a day like this, it would be hard to get any real work done anyway. Come in, let us toast our good fortune." Tanos turned to pick up an oversized elephant bottle of red wine, a gift of the nobles. The Argivians liked their wines blood red and furniture polish bitter. Urza fetched 2 goblets, one for each of the other adults, and his own chalice. The last had been Urza's own handiwork. He had converted the central pump that had worked in the last of Tokasia's onulets, a beast now as mythological in Argiv as minotaurs and rocks. Tanos poured a small amount for himself and for Kayla and a more generous helping for Urza. Urza raised his chalice in a toast. "We have passed through the fire over the past few years, and that has tempered us. Now the fires grow hotter still, but we are stronger, and we are proof against the flame. To Argiv and Corliss." "To the memory of Yosha," said Kayla. "To the new Lord High Artificer and Lord Protector of the Realms," said Tanos. "To the new Chief Scholar," replied Urza, and metal clanked between them. Urza drained his cup and said, "We had best be moving along. If we are late, the Argivians will make being late part of every ceremony from here until doomsday." Urza started for the door, then paused. He whistled a small tune, identical to the one Tanos had used minutes before. The mechanical bird unfurled its wings and sailed off the mantelpiece. Harbin swatted at it, but missed, and the bird fluttered around the room, dodging the young boy's best-aimed shots. The ceremony itself was typical of all Argivian ceremonies, long-winded and stifling. Tanos had thought he would not survive the wedding earlier this month, but this was infinitely worse, for he and Urza were at the center of the activity. There's no chance to sneak out when you're on the podium with all eyes on you. The great hall once had been a cathedral to a god now forgotten and out of fashion. It was packed with all manner of Argivian nobles, clad in finery that swelled their forms to twice their size. In addition, the incense used in the hall was overwhelmed by the clashing odors of perfume worn by the Argivian women and some of the men. Tanos wondered if he could afford to sneeze in his tight outfit, and his eyes watered. The Argivians bothered Tanos, and the nobles worst of all. Owing to the former apprentice's Yoshan origin, most tended to treat him like a rustic relative. He always felt he was out of place in Krug, a boy from the coastal provinces in the big city. At least, though, in Krug he was among Yoshans. Many of the Argivians seemed to assume that all Yoshans had trouble with the language. They spoke slowly and loudly to him. Worse still were those Argivians who acted as if he were still no more than Urza's apprentice. Occasionally they did not address him at all in the Lord High Artificer's office, as if he were no more than a hanger-on, a dog body, a servant to Urza. Even when the artificer made sure to mention Tanos' inventions, such as the Triskelion, a mobile fortification, the eyes of the nobles glazed over, and Tanos could almost hear their ears clicking off. No, thought Tanos, worst of all were the stiff collars. He reached for his, but halted his finger in time. It would be just like a rural bumpkin to pull at his neckline in the middle of a ceremony. The ritual was interminable. There was a presentation of honors, a recognition of foreign delegations, a recognition of important nobles that was effectively a roll call for the entire cathedral, a platitude by the chamberlain of Argiv that was longer than most sermons. This was followed by a listing of good things that had happened of late, which were, truly or otherwise, ascribed to the efforts of Urza and his faithful assistant Tanos. The tawny-haired man's position on the podium gave him a chance to sweep the crowd with his eyes and pick out faces. Kayla and Harbin in the front row. She seemed nearly wilted in her gown, but was still game, while the boy had surrendered to boredom a half-hour back and was now kicking the sides of the pew in a desultory fashion. The apprentices were led by Ricklau, the schoolmaster, the senior students, Rendell and Sanwell, at his side. Sharman was in full military harness and looking almost comfortable in his dress uniform. There were others, Argivian noblewomen in full regalia, and young courtiers vying with them for flashiness, Corlesian merchant lords, more restrained, but still bedecked in the most sumptuous of fashions. There were dwarven diplomats from the Sardian mountains, a dour group of diminutive people who made the Argivians look positively festive, and the Corlesians even-handed. Their mountains held much of the resources that Urza needed, but they were willing to trade their metals and stones for gold, which Urza considered a minor metal of little real value in the battlefield. There were Yoshans present, dressed colorfully but simply. They were refugees who had fled to Argiv after the fall and represented some of the most powerful families in the region, yet next to the Argivians they seemed like poor relations. There were also others whose identity Tawnos was unsure. There was a band of fur-wearing barbarians from Malpuri, a group of priests, black-robed servants with mechanical devices hung around their necks. Gikshians, Tawnos reminded himself, from a monastery far to the northwest. Urza had received an offer from them to aid in his studies, but Tawnos found them too fanatical in their devotion to the machines themselves. They treated even the ornithopters as if they were living creatures. It made Tawnos nervous, and he avoided them, as did most of the rest of the populace who had no time for gods of any stripe. The Chamberlain's invocation ground to a close, and he was replaced by the Lord of Corliss, whose voice was slightly more pleasant, but who seemed intent on showing everyone that her nation could be just as long-winded as the Argivians. She spoke of the recent events, of the erecting of the defensive towers along the borders of both Corliss and Argiv, and of the continual ornithopteral patrols that kept them safe from the Falaji devils. It was more than just Urza's devices that kept them safe for the moment, Tawnos thought. Word had reached Penregon that Mishra had plundered most of Yosha and drained Zegon as well, and was looking for new supply sources. Apparently, the attempts to fold Sarenth far to the west into the Falaji Empire had not gone well, and a huge force had settled there to besiege the principal cities. Instead of gaining needed resources, Mishra had succeeded in opening another front. Should he continue in this fashion, Urza's brother would soon surround himself with enemies. Of course, the situation was not lost on the Argivian nobles, nor the Corlisian merchants who wanted to reopen their precious trade routes. Now was the time, they said, to press the advantage. Now was the time to retake Yosha. Now was the time to put Mishra in his place. Urza had surprised Tawnos with his response to the noble demands. In Yosha, he retreated to his ornery and let others do the talking and planning. Now he met with the nobles and the merchant lords whenever possible, and never shirked from showing them some new device or implementation. They, in turn, had opened their vaults to him, allowing him access to the power stones, land, and other resources needed to build. Tawnos thought he knew Urza's plan. The artificer would continue to build his Avengers, Ornithopters, Sentinels, and soldiers until he had more than any dragon engine could best. Only then would he move against his brother. Tawnos hoped Urza would have time to carry out his plan. Given the enthusiasm for the Argivians and the greed of the Corlisians, he was not sure. The Lord of Corlos finally surrendered the podium, and his young majesty presented the titles. Urza knelt, a feat in itself considering the stiffness in his costume, and the young king placed the Lord High Artificer's mitre on Urza's head. Then he laid the scepter of the Protector of the Realms in Urza's hands. The crowd burst into applause as Urza rose and recognized their cheers. They were quieter for Tawnos, but only slightly. He received the heavy velvet robes, lengthened to cover his large frame, of the chief scholar. He knelt as well, and the king placed a golden circlet on his head. Even kneeling, Tawnos, almost as tall as the king, and had to bow forward to prevent the Argivian from having to reach up. Then the benediction, and Tawnos swore he saw the entire audience shudder to a man as the Chamberlain remounted the podium and launched into a rousing screed against the Falaji devils. That's what was missing, Tawnos thought. There were no Falaji present, at least none who would announce their heritage. The Chamberlain declared Urza to be Lord Protector of all the lands not held by the Falaji and their allies. In other words, all lands not under the rulership of Mishra. Finally, the ceremony was over, and the people filed out for a ceremonial banquet, which would be dominated by even more lengthy speeches. Every merchant and noble with at least some claim to the title would rise to deliver his own thoughts on the matter. Tawnos couldn't wait. Back in his chambers, Urza smiled and pulled the mitre from his head. It was a heavy thing, and Tawnos had wondered if the older man would fall over from the weight. Urza hefted the mitre, clearly delighted. Finally, Tawnos said, "I've never seen you this cheerful when people praised you in Krug. Is it the fact that they are your own countrymen that make you smile?" Urza looked up, puzzled for a moment. Then he smiled broadly. "You think that is it? That I've become a vain old popinjay thriving on the adulation of the crowds? Look into my new hat, my former student, to see the truth of the matter." Tawnos moved over and looked over the brim of the upturned mitre. Gemstones were sewn into the lining of the tall hat. That's why it was so heavy. No, not gemstones, Tawnos realized. Power stones, pure and unflawed. There were more than had been in the chest Urza had shown him 5 years ago. Tawnos looked at Urza, and the Lord Protector beamed a warm smile. That was why he put up with all the pomp and trappings of the ceremony, the chief scholar realized. That was why he endured the speeches and courted the nobles, and why, while claiming modesty, had accepted the post of Lord High Artificer, all to gain more power, all to gain more resources. Urza left the mitre in Tanos' hands and went to fetch his chalice before the pair left for an interminable banquet. Tanos shook his head. His former master had not changed at all. His devices were still at the center of his universe. Tanos did not know if that knowledge made him feel better or worse.